Okay, so I am in a grocery store in Saratoga Springs, Utah, and behind me is a book rack, something that you don't see all that often anymore. They're getting harder and harder to find. So I thought I'd come over here and check out some books, and I am going to buy whatever is number one on this shelf. No matter what it is, I'm going to buy it and read it. So let's check it out. Of course, it would be Stephen King. I'm sure I can tell this story. I'm also sure no one will believe it. Okay, so I bought the book, and I'm out here in front of the grocery store that I bought the book in, and I'm waiting for some friends to pick me up, and we're gonna go out to dinner. So I'm sitting in the, I think the employee break area, and I'm gonna get a head start on reading. So let's dive in, see how I like this book. All right, so I read the first 17 pages, and my friend is almost here, so I'm gonna give you my quick thoughts. The opening of this book, nothing has happened in the present. Everything has gone back into the past, and so we're just getting backstory right now, which is not really a typical way that Stephen King starts his stories. So we're getting kind of the David Copperfield version of a narrative here. So we're going back into like, this is all my past, and I don't know anything about what's going to happen in the book yet, which is not really typical. So still looking for the story to actually start. Okay, so I got to page 50 tonight, and so far this is very comfortable territory for Stephen King. The kind of homegrown character and sort of the real homey backstory really is Stephen King's strong suit. And this is sort of where he's at his best, is this character building, and he's building these really strong foundations to story. Stephen King's premises in all of his books are usually very strong. In even the books that I turned out not to really like very much, I usually have very strong premises. It's the execution in the end that sometimes I don't always like. But so far, so good. I'm looking forward to seeing where this is going. I'm comfortable with Stephen King's comfort zone, and this book really fits right in with that so far. Okay, so I am a quarter of the way through this 600-page book, and it is a slow burn for sure, but I like it quite a lot so far. In fact, there's a lot more that I like than I dislike. So I'm gonna just get a couple of my little nitpicks out of the way, and I'll recap the things that I like about the book a little bit later. But let me get my quick hot takes out of the way. One, 17-year-olds in 2013 probably wouldn't refer to the internet as the net. That sounds like an old man trying to talk like a teenager, which is pretty typical of Stephen King. Another thing, similarly, Stephen King seems to think that to make his teenagers seem more likable, they have to watch old movies like The Manchurian Candidate and read old noir novels and read newspapers because they seem retro, instead of reading the news on his phone or whatever. Even just reading the news as a teenager, he's a jock athlete. Instead of watching YouTube videos and keeping up with social media, he does old man stuff, and he has old man hobbies. Kind of feel like that's like a pitfall that Stephen King falls into with some of his younger characters. He doesn't do a very good job writing a good modern teenager. 50s and 60s kids seem like the age group that Stephen King is most comfortable writing, and he's never gotten past that. Aside from a few token gestures towards writing a modern teenager, this book feels like it could take place in the 60s. You remove a couple references to cell phones and laptops, which the book does not hinge on. Nothing in the plot requires the use of these devices. This book could very easily take place in any decade, which is fine. That's okay, but I kind of wish that he would just keep writing these books in an era that he's comfortable with, instead of trying to shoehorn his characters into a decade that he's not good at. Anyway, these are pretty minor quibbles. The rest of the story is pretty good, and I really like where it's going. Where I left off, this last chapter is really taken a turn, and so it's been a slow burn up until the last chapter, and quite a lot has happened in the last few dozen pages. I have a much stronger feeling of the direction where this book is going, and I'm still very interested in this book. So I'm excited, and I want to see where this is going. Okay, so I'm on page 249, just a little under halfway. This book is getting kind of weird. Not weird in a bad way, weird in a very kind of typical Stephen King way. A little bit too typical in some ways. Before I said that he was leaning into his comfort zone, and this is starting to go down some very familiar roads. This book is similar in some ways to Pet Sematary, The Dark Tower, Black House, and Talisman. This book is similar in some ways to Lisey's Story. These are all distinct and prominent Stephen King novels that stand on their own merits. And now this book, Fairy Tale, is kind of coming in and retreading some of that same territory. So I'm right into the meat of this story, and I'm ready to keep going. Except that it's late at night, and we got a big day tomorrow. We are traveling tomorrow, so we've got to pack up and everything in the morning. So I'm going to pick this book up again at the campsite tomorrow, so I will see you there. Oh, one other thing. There's a character in this story, and his name is Howard Bowditch. Spelled like this. But that is not what I see in my mind when I read his name. I see Howard Blowtorch. Why? I don't know. I'm just stupid, I guess. But like, his name is Howard Blowtorch. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make any sense. But there's a character in a Stephen King novel named Howard Blowtorch. You know, if I have a message with this channel, it's that I believe that we all have more time to read than we think we do. And my philosophy is to bring a book. Bring a book with you wherever you go. Whether you're going camping or whether you're at work, bring a physical book with you in your car. Keep a book with you on your phone, an ebook, an audiobook, whatever it is. And even if you only get to read for 5 minutes and you only end up reading one extra book a year, that's one book you read that you might not have read otherwise. Just bring a book. Whatever it is you're doing, bring a book. I am on page 349 of Fairy Tale by Stephen King, so that puts me at a little over halfway. All right, so with this like unusually straightforward name of the book, Fairy Tale, King basically promises us a modern fairy tale, and a strong one at that. And now being over halfway through the book, I can confidently say that he has delivered one to us. He has delivered on that promise. King has given us his version of things like vampires, zombies, the apocalypse, curses, doppelgangers, telekinesis, cars that come to life. But this is King's foray into what his version of a fairy tale might be if it was sifted through the cheesecloth filter of his weird imagination. So Fairy Tale plunges our quasi-modern hero into an unreal territory. The slow book opening of this book really transitioned into a fast-paced episodic page-turner, and it really happened at the turn of a page. So one moment I'm reading the slow burn, the next minute I'm reading the page turner. And that happens when our main character gets kind of plunged into the fantasy world after being ripped out of the real world. And that's only to be expected. It's a narrative device that King uses to unsettle us. He rips us out of the real world and plunges us into the fantasy world, just as he does with his main character. A note for dog lovers. If you feel any affection for dogs, Radar, the German Shepherd, is going to steal your heart. I took some notes for myself to help sound more spontaneous, and they're right down here. And I'm just going to read this note to you right off my iPad because I can't say this note. I don't know why I wrote this so complicated. So, if you're looking for a comparison, Fairy Tale is most similar to Dark Tale in that it is a romp through an ill-begotten phantasmal likeness of Earth where the reader almost gets comfortable until the inevitable horrors are unleashed. There. Okay. All right, now that being said, I have a few other things to say. Stephen King's imagination has not failed us here. There are some uniquely strange and fantastically creepy elements at play here. And while there's really nothing significantly new coming out of these pages, by and large, the vintage King that we're getting is reminiscent of the good old days rather than of the books we might rather forget. You know what I'm talking about if you've been around for a while. So we're out here in beautiful Idaho. This is the Blacktail Reservoir. So we are camped just on the other side of the trees over here, and we don't have much planned for the rest of today. And I hope to go down to the reservoir and just finish reading the rest of this book. I'm really excited to see where this is going. I keep saying that. I'm excited to see where this is going. I've probably said that a million times. Where I left off last night was quite the cliffhanger. Charlie and Radar kind of wrapped up a bit of a mission, and it wasn't 100% resolved the way that I thought it was going to. So we're going to have to see where it's going from here. So here we go. I wasn't going to update you until I finished the book, but I've jumped ahead 100 pages from the last update, and quite a lot has happened. I need to jump in here and say something about this because unfortunately the book has gone downhill fast. I'm just being honest here. Like, so earlier in the book, I talked about how it opened up with the slow burn, and I really enjoyed how it started. And then it changed gears, and it was more of a fast-paced episodic tale, and it was more bizarre, and you know, got into some really typical weird Stephen King storytelling. But it was like you turned the page, and it was a totally different book. Well, that happened again, and it's like now this part 3 is like reading a totally different book. I mean, it sort of ostensibly takes place in the same world that part 2 took place in. It has different goals, it has different characters, it has different themes surrounding the main character who's the same in all 3 of these parts, but you know, even he seems sort of different. You know, he's changing, which is what, you know, you expect to happen to your main character over the course of a novel, and that's good, you know, but he's not changing through an established goal because his goals are changing. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to even remember the stuff that happened at the beginning of this book. It's kind of driving me crazy, and I mean, it's the thing. Here's the thing is, like, the stuff happening right now is entertaining and it's interesting, and taken on its own, it could be fun to read, and it could be gripping, with one big exception, and that is the villain in this part. The villain in part 3 here is very underwhelming for 2 reasons. One, Stephen King describes him as Donald Sutherland, and that is my biggest pet peeve in all of writing. When you compare a character to somebody we know in the real world, do not do that. That is very lazy. You could describe him as having a white beard. You could describe him as having crow's feet or expressive twinkly eyes. You could say that he speaks with a distinguished voice. You could say that he's tall, for God's sakes. You know, you could just describe how he looks. You could talk about the manner of his speech and how in the carriage of his walk, and you could talk about like many things about the character. You could just describe Donald Sutherland. But to say that he looked like Donald Sutherland is the cheapest excuse for character description that there is. And shame on you, Stephen King, for doing it. And I do not forgive you for it. Okay. But not only that, the character that is being described as Donald Sutherland is also not a very good character. He is not threatening in any way. I don't tremble when he appears on the page. And he's sort of a middleman. His lieutenant is scarier, and the man he reports to is scarier. He's completely superfluous, but he's supposed to be in charge of everything that's going on. But I don't care about him, and so far, he doesn't even need to be in the book. I think this part 3 would have made an interesting novella in some other story. I don't see how this is going to support all of the events that happened in part 1 and 2. I don't see the connection. I see the connection to the larger world, but I don't see the connection to the events in parts 1 and 2. You literally turn the page from like 348 to 349, and it's a totally different story. It's disorienting in not a good way. I got about a quarter of this book left. I've got today and tomorrow. I'm going to read until it's done. I'm leaving Utah in 2 days. So I want to have this book done by then. I'm going to hopefully wrap this video up before I leave. Hopefully, and I'm still hopeful because this book hasn't been a waste of time. And there are large parts of this book that I do still enjoy. And I am still hopeful. And I do have faith that Stephen King is a good enough author that he can pull this one out. But it's going to take some fairy tale magic to make this one work in the last 150 pages. Okay, so I spent the afternoon reading fairy tale and I finished the book. So everything else that I'm going to say from here on out is going to sort of slightly touch on spoiler territory. Not actual spoilers. I will not tell you what happens. And I'm not going to go into detail. But I won't be able to talk about what I liked and disliked about this book without explaining a little bit about what this book is about and where it fell apart for me. And after the halfway point of this book, it took a turn and it just never recovered. It wasn't totally spoiled, you know, and it's just, maybe it's a little unfair. I've read everything by Stephen King, including his old stuff, his new stuff, his good stuff, his bad stuff. And I tend to compare everything that I read to my favorite books of his. And this just doesn't even come close to stacking up to those books. There are elements of this book that is reminiscent of some of those works, but as the book went on, it's just so clear to me that he lost steam for this story. I don't know. I'm making assumptions, right? I don't know what's going on in Stephen King's head. I don't know what it's like for him to write a book. But as a reader who's read everything that he's written, all of his short stories, all of his nonfiction, and I mean, everything that I can get my hands on, I've read. It feels to me, from an educated Stephen King constant reader, that this book wasn't one of those that spoke to him all the way through. Books like 11/22/63, I felt like that was a passion project of his that he felt fired up to write every single day. And every time I picked that book up to read it, I felt passion and power in every single page. This book could have been so much better. It was maybe not this close, but it was this close to being a fantastic book. For those of you who haven't read this book yet, I'm going to wrap this up for you right now. I want to say that this is maybe worth reading if you like the more fantasy style writing that Stephen King has done. But be prepared for him to switch horses in midstream, pull the rug out from underneath you, to change gears, whatever the metaphor you want. It's not really a very pleasing magic trick, though. And some of the stuff that he spends a good deal of time setting up just be prepared for him to maybe sort of forget all about it, because you might not really come back to it. And as a reader, I find that very dissatisfying. Okay, I'm gonna get my thoughts together and I'm gonna give you the full wrap up of this book with more details. And if you don't want to know what this book is really about, then you should just bail right here. All right, I think I've got my thoughts together on this one. Oh boy. Okay, so you've stuck with me this long. I haven't read very many reviews on this book. In fact, there's only one place I even looked at reviews, and that was the Bookmarks newsletter that I got in my email. I have not read any reviews for Fairy Tale anywhere else, including Amazon and Goodreads, but I have a feeling that my review here is not quite in line with popular opinion. But I'm okay with that. In a supposedly rave review, jeez, okay. I don't know if that's getting picked up here or not. It probably is. I'm just going to talk through it. I'm really sorry about this dog. In a supposedly rave review that the New York Times put out, the book reviewer Matt Bell said, and I'm going to have to read the quote here, "Fairy Tale is a multiverse traversing, genre hopping, intertextual mashup with plenty of Easter eggs for regular King devotees." I think that dog's barking at me because I'm talking. It's not going to stop. I'm not a fan of Easter eggs and pop culture references, either as flourishes to stories or as structural bedrock to storytelling. But this book gives a lot of both. These things, Easter eggs and pop culture references, tend to be popular, so I understand why a popular author like Stephen King would employ them in his book. But naming a character in your story Princess Leia, and then needlessly and laboriously directing your character's thoughts towards Star Wars, does not rise to the level of intertextuality. It's cheap, and when it comes down to it, it's wholly inadequate. That said, Princess Leia in the book Fairy Tale is a really great character. She's a cool addition to the story. Her place within the lore is fantastic, and I loved every scene that she was in. Leia is a captivating character, and not only is she my favorite side character, she might be my favorite character in the book. I think I like her more than I like the main character in this book. It's just that her name is immaterial. She is nothing like the spunky princess from Alderaan, thankfully. She's nothing, it means nothing. It's just a name drop. It doesn't mean anything. And I just wish that Stephen King had chosen something else so I didn't have to see Carrie Fisher's face every time Princess Leia shows up in this book. She's described as having blonde hair, and she's got other physical features that are obviously different from Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia. But still, what is the point of that? It's just dumb. You see, real intertextuality is when the author causes in the reader or the viewer to recognize in the work something that evokes memories of other works and thus evokes feelings, usually nostalgia in this nostalgia drunk culture that we've all grown addicted to. But what King does here is simply name drop a whole bunch of old sci-fi movies and films we're supposed to believe he watched on Turner Classic Movies, children's shows, and as well as like various other like classic horror literature. Like whenever he sees something in this new portal world that he just can't really describe in his own words, so he just compares it to something that he's seen in pop culture or read in a book somewhere. There are so many references. Dave Matthews Band lyrics even get a reference. I mean, just throw anything you want in there, Stephen King. Like, just do whatever you want. Who cares? I mean, writing books is just for fun anyway, right? God. And that whole Donald Sutherland thing, I can't get over it. I mean, I have a question for you guys in the comments. Do these things all sound like something a modern teenager is interested in? Like, are these the interests of a modern teenager? Or do these things sound like something a 74-year-old horror writer and film buff would be interested in, and he's just living through this teenager? Which one do you think is more likely? I'm not saying teenagers can't watch Turner Classic Movies and can't read Bram Stoker. I'm just saying. Sounds an awful lot like the author is placing himself in his main character's shoes. That's fine. Okay, so if you're a teenager watching this, let me ask you a question. Without looking him up, what's your favorite Donald Sutherland movie? Put it in the comments. I'd be curious to know. What's his best role? Do you know off the top of your head? I only want to know if you're a teenager. Nobody else is allowed to post an answer to that question. But if you do have one, I'd love to hear it. Legitimately, I'd love to hear it. Also, as a side note, like, I understand that this book, I understand that I'm calling Charlie Reed a modern teenager, and that this book takes place in 2013, and at the time of this book is published in 2022, so at the time of publication, it's 9 years old. But even if this book was published in 2013, all the references would still be out of date. So I'm comfortable calling Charlie Reed a modern teenager relative to all of his references. 9 years ago isn't that long ago. Give me a break. Anyway, my point is, intertextuality is not the same thing as name dropping. Okay? But, okay, got that out of my system. But I do have to say that something occurred to me about halfway through this book, that Stephen King slipped something in kind of under the radar earlier in the book that I didn't think about until much later. And that was in a discussion between Charlie Reed and Howard Blowtorch. They were talking about Carl Jung and the Jungian archetypes. At the time, I just passed it off as an example of how not to be elitist. It's kind of hard to describe until you read that section yourself. But I decided to look it up and kind of refresh myself on the Jungian archetypes, specifically the collective unconscious. And so the definition for the collective unconscious, let me just read that to you. This is from the APA Dictionary of Psychology. The collective unconscious is a unique component in that Jung believed that this part of the psyche served as a form of psychological inheritance. It contained all of the knowledge and experiences that humans share as a species. So I don't think that this reference to Carl Jung was unintentional at all, and not an incidental name drop. I think there's a reason for this. And it makes me believe that all of the other name dropping that has gone on so far in this book and will continue to go on all the way to the end of this book goes a little bit further than just lazy writing. And though the origin of the world goes left unsolved as a mystery, I believe that this portal world that Charlie enters and spends most of the book in may have been created by the memories and experiences of Howard and of himself. And it's starting to get dark. I need to wrap this up. So let me explain this. So consider Ready Player One. The Oasis is a virtual world that is created by computer programmers, and it is just chock full with pop culture references that are there to feed the player's sense of nostalgia, right? And by proxy, the readers and the moviegoers' sense of nostalgia. But what if in this book there's a real world, an entire dimension that is created through that experience, through the imagination and the experiences of a person who enters that world? Like, the people who first enter the world through that portal shape and create that entire world through their experiences. And so all of those He-Man references and Walking Dead references and everything else, right, to some degree, in some mashup, is going to appear in this world because they've experienced somewhere else, you know, in the books that they've read, in the movies they've watched, and the lives that they've lived. Because not everything that Charlie recognizes in this portal world comes from books and movies. Some of this stuff is eerily similar to things that have happened to him in his real life, and I won't go into what that is, but I'm already saying more than I really want to say, but I haven't given any parts of the book away in saying this. It's just, this is all just my own theory here. None of this goes answered in the book, and it's not even a question that's asked by the book. It's all just thoughts that I've had while reading this myself. So anyway, though this whole Jungian collective unconscious connection between worlds is just my working theory, it's actually my favorite part of the book. Thinking about this is my favorite part of fairy tale. In fact, you know, this portal fantasy is nothing new to Stephen King. He's done it many times. He's pretty good at it, and I really enjoy trying to imagine how these worlds are connected, how they came to be in the first place, where they are and when they are, but mostly how they're all connected to each other. And more specifically, like, which stories that Stephen King have written take place in which world, because sometimes it's not explicitly spelled out in the stories, and there are entire fandoms that you can explore on the internet that are devoted to discovering this. And I have deliberately avoided going down those rabbit holes, not because I don't want to know, but because it's fun for me to explore that for myself. And I have a feeling that we are going to see a lot more of the world that Stephen King created in fairy tale in future works. This is not the last we've seen of this world. There's so much lore, there's so much original material in this book that he's not going to be able to resist dropping some of these things into other books. Mark my words, September 14th, 2022, I said it here first. So, intertextuality, not exactly. Name dropping, yeah, kinda, a little bit, but there seems to be at least a plausible excuse for it. If you can get over it, then I think you'll find that there's a method behind the madness there. I actually had quite a lot of other notes that I had written down that I'm not going to go into, and not only because it's getting dark here, but because it really delves into spoiler territory, and I don't want to go into that. I'm going to leave it on one final note, and I need to talk about the end of the book a little bit. Stephen King struggles with his endings more than just about any author I've ever read. He wrote such a fantastic opening to this book. I was sucked in. I got invested in everything that was happening. I filed away all these little details and made all these calculations in my head about what would need to happen for this to come back around, and that to come back around, for this to matter, and for that to, you know, play into other things. And as new developments happen, I think, but how is this going to dovetail into that? And like, I'm trying to make all these connections. But the major disappointment of this book is that that's not how Stephen King writes. He doesn't write thinking that all these things need to connect, and that anything that he wrote in the beginning needs to matter at the end. In the end, it's a major disappointment, because the things that I love about this book at the beginning don't end up mattering at the end. And it's not to say that the things at the end of the book were bad. It wasn't a bad ending, except for one. Scratch that. It wasn't a good ending. How am I going to say this without ruining things for you? Listen, I counted them up. Stephen King sets up confrontations with no less than 9 villains and sort of evil sources, right? 9 confrontations that you're anticipating to come up in the last 100 pages of the book. And in the last 100 pages, you've got to wrap up plot lines, character arcs, and wedge in an epilogue that nobody wants. That's just a lot to put into the last 100 pages of a book. 9 confrontations with bad guys? Needless to say that not all of those are very satisfying. In fact, one of them was so bad, I slammed the book shut and had to walk away from it for about 15 minutes. I guess you could say I got invested in the book. Like, that's good, right? But like, you can't get me invested in the book and then just blow off a major confrontation that you've been building up for literally hundreds of pages. I guess you can do that if you're Stephen King, but I don't think anybody else can get away with doing that. And I think a lot of stuff happens in Stephen King books because he's Stephen King. Somebody needs to tell him when he's off track. I don't think he's got enough people that are telling him when he's off track. And if they're telling him, he's not listening. It's disappointing. My final review here is that, and listen, I'm just gonna read this final paragraph that I wrote in my notes. I don't know how to say this off the top of my head, so I'm just gonna read this, if that's okay with you. The ending of this book was a total mess. The only part I cared about was how King was going to resolve Princess Leia's part in the story, which in fact I liked quite a lot. So thank you for not messing up my favorite character, Mr. King. That was nice of you. So that was good, right? But following a fairly gripping conclusion to the dull part in the middle of the book, the final stretch of this book felt aimless and bloated. Fairy Tale is rich with lore, and there is loads of originality in this book. But as the ending winds toward its conclusion, so few of the final events are based on that lore, but instead are based on new information we're getting as we go along. Discovering a new path at the end of the book, when the whole world has been described for hundreds of pages, is a disappointment. And my final review is that Fairy Tale is jam-packed with squandered potential. Lots of really cool stuff in here. Stephen King is wonderful at creating characters. The premise for this book is tremendous, and the world is going to be fun to revisit perhaps someday, and I hope I see it again in another book. But the way the plot is structured is uneven, tedious at times, disappointing. The conclusion to a lot of character arcs is disappointing, especially the villainous character arcs are disappointing. I think that this book could have been one of his best fantasy efforts, but instead it's just sort of a book that he wrote. So all right, well, it is really getting dark now. I don't know if it looks dark on the film or not, but this dog is still barking at me. So I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to head home, and I'm leaving Utah tomorrow, and I'm going to see if I can find a place to leave this book behind. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me what book you think I ought to read next. There's lots of good stuff coming out, and I've got a long list, but I'm willing to add new books to it. So drop a comment down there. Let me know what you think I ought to read. If you want to see a review like this, yeah, I'll read it. See ya. So I found a place to leave the book behind before I leave Utah, right here at the laundromat. Why not? Nice public place. I'm going to leave it here on the shelf and hope somebody takes it home. Hey, remember, wherever you go, bring a book.